So, hello everyone, especially those of you who actually made it out in person, because there was a really large storm here in the last couple of days. I actually drove my car into a ditch outside of Sinaboya. So it was actually kind of convenient because I was stuck, but I was actually stuck much closer to Moose Jaw than where I normally am because I live in Val Marie, which is 3 hours out. So anyway, that was lucky. And now I get to be in Moose Jaw, which is always wonderful. So my name is Alex McPhee. I am a freelance cartographer. I actually publish maps for a living. And I have been graciously invited to present a little bit about my livelihood and about my upcoming major product, which is creatively titled Alex McPhee's Saskatchewan. It's a 36 by 66 inch wall map. And were it not for the first October snowstorm, I would have 2,000 copies of it in my hand right now. So let's get a little bit into some other details about myself and my business. This is my livelihood, although I'm actually self-taught. My degree is a bachelor's in geophysics from the University of Alberta. One thing I'm obsessed with, which helps me get along with library and museum people, is I'm a keen amateur local historian. At home in Val Marie, I'm actually chair of our village grain elevator museum. And actually, my obsession with railway history is one of the things that drove me towards publishing giant maps of the Canadian prairies for fun. And I've also just been elected vice president of the Canadian Cartographic Association, which both of us are going to have a lot of fun in that new capacity. It's going to be interesting the next few years, getting more in touch with other people who are in my rare line of work. But I put together a whole slide to start off, which is just kind of about how does someone get into this? Why am I doing this? How did I get here? And and I'll open right away with one of the biggest secrets of my profession, which is that in this country, if you call yourself an engineer, there are legal consequences, because if people trust self-proclaimed engineers, then they're going to have bridges that collapse. If you call yourself a surveyor, there are consequences, because if you trust self-declared surveyors, you're going to eventually have bridges that are going to collapse. But cartographer, unlike those other two, is not a licensed or a regulated profession. Anyone can call themselves a cartographer. It's just like being an artist or a business consultant. I feel like I almost shouldn't give this away, because when I introduce myself as a cartographer, people really place a lot of trust into me automatically. They think, well, anyone who makes maps must be really aware of what they're doing, and they must have all kinds of proper mechanisms and structures to ensure accountability and accuracy. Unfortunately, I have to dispel that myth. I self-publish. I don't even have an editor. So I take my work very, very seriously. But the thing that distinguishes me from some of those more common and more quantitative related professions like engineering and surveying is that cartography is really an artistic discipline. It's not just about collecting measurements of the earth or finding the most accurate data. It's about presenting it in a way that is interesting, clear, and is tailored to the audience. So, and that requires a significant background for me in graphic design. And I actually do a lot of painting in my spare time, not fantastic painting, but my goal is to not just deal with information, not just to crunch and process data. My job is to make it clear and interesting. And that takes a little bit of a interdisciplinary mindset. So the purpose of this slide is I want to give away a few other things about what being a cartographer means nowadays. First of all, it's a really unusual job. There are not a lot of members of the Canadian Cartographic Association. And that is because of the digital revolution. All of what I do goes through my laptop. And all of the old ways of dealing with pantographs and correction fluid and engraving devices, all of the people with those skills are mostly retired and out of the market. So there's a lot of specialized institutional knowledge in cartography that's almost lost because the digital transition has made it so much easier to process huge amounts of geographic data. Nowadays, in the sciences and in other professions, we kind of just expect scientists to make their own maps just on their computers with no special training. That's a fantastic business opportunity for me because a lot of scientists don't like making their own maps on their own computers, because designing maps is a rather specialized subset of design and geography. So when scientists and professionals are required to make maps, but they know that they're not that good at it and they know that it frustrates them, very often they come to me. So ever since I graduated and I started marketing myself as a freelance cartographer, I have actually been doing pretty well for myself. But the state of the profession is definitely different than what it was 50 years ago, when cartography classes were actually much more common, and when the fundamentals of map design, which I am self-taught in, though those fundamentals were actually much better known and they were taught much more widely to people in many other disciplines than they are today. So it's almost like sometimes it feels like I mostly traffic in secret knowledge, but I don't want it to be secret. I think my job is really cool. So this presentation, I'm hoping to give some of those trade secrets away and to talk about what actually goes into my work. So as I said before, I specialize in wall maps. These are huge. These are huge, more than 5 feet tall, and they are made for display. So they're printed on paper that looks good on a wall. They actually don't fold very well at all. And so my first wall map was actually the province of Alberta. First of all, because I went to the U of A, so I was able to actually travel the entire province in my summers there. And so originally this was just a fun little diversion, but in 2019, I won a student award at the North American Cartographic Society's conference, and that made me realize, oh gosh, I guess I could actually try marketing this thing. So I went through 3 versions of this map. I've won awards from 3 different countries for design and quality of work, which is really cool. And I ordered 2,000 copies of Alberta, and I've been selling them through my web store ever since. But I thought Alberta would be a safe business prospect because, as most people know, Saskatchewan has 1 million people and Alberta has 4 million. The issue is that most of those 4 million people are originally from Saskatchewan. So once I started planning Saskatchewan as a sequel to the Alberta map, I started getting way more interest, way more press coverage, And even though this map isn't on the market yet, it's about to be, I have more pre-orders now than I have managed to sell copies of Alberta in a year in business. So, and this is, I've been talking to, I just got out of a conference of cartographers a week ago. And so that was one of the funniest things I was telling people was local pride and market demand is not always based just on population figures. So I put about 1,000 hours into this map. It shows a lot of things that no other printed reference map ever has. And I am hoping to kind of deconstruct and show a little bit of behind the scenes for what actually went into this. So I'll start with software. This is because this is kind of the plainest answer I have to give. So I said before that almost all cartographic work nowadays is digital. That means it's all done through a kind of software that's called GIS, Geographic Information Systems. When they were coming out with this stuff, I guess they thought that GIS would be a better brand name than calling it mapping software. So now everybody in the GIS industry has to spend 2 minutes at the beginning of every presentation explaining what the hell GIS stands for. I have the benefit of being able to use a free GIS called QGIS. That's short for Quantum Geographic Information System. And this is just a piece of software that's maintained by volunteers, which is why its price tag is $0. You can actually try adding new features to it yourself if you are so inclined. And I love QGIS. It fulfills all of my technical needs. It is the reason why I am able to get by in this profession as a self-taught person. So huge recommendation. I'm very grateful to the people who maintain this piece of code that my livelihood depends on. So that means most of the magic is just me looking at this on my computer for very long periods of time. I throw data into QGIS. It displays everything properly in the correct place on Earth's surface. And then I use QGIS to set rules for how the data should end up looking. So if a town has a population over 500, then I tell QGIS, make that label bigger and set it in a semi-bold typeface, and the computer obeys. So this is actually, it's a little difficult to make this look interesting to an audience, but the bulk of what I actually do in my home office is, it looks very much like this. Then I also use another free program called Inkscape, which is a vector graphic software. It's basically the freeware version of Adobe Illustrator for anyone who's ever used that. Inkscape is a little worse than Adobe Illustrator. So when I tell people that I use it for everything, including publishing giant wall maps, they kind of look at me funny. But again, because of these incredible volunteer projects, because people are maintaining this software for free, I was able to teach myself almost everything in my profession without ever having to pay any licensing fees. So, and these programs are also super popular in the developing world where license fees matter a lot more. So I'm really excited to be part of this open source technical project, and I always try to give it a shout out when I talk about my work. But enough about software, let's get into data. So, actually, this is one of the fundamentals of modern GIS, geographic information systems. Everything in a map consists of many layers, each corresponding to a particular type of feature. What a GIS program is designed to do is to keep track of all those layers and give you full control over what's in them and how they look, and allow you to make derivative calculations of other things based on raw data. So sometimes I get asked, well, how many layers does your map have? And I actually kind of dicker about it, and I say, oh, it's complicated because all my point features are really just saved in one file, but I have about 30 different kinds of point feature. So conceptually, there's more than 50 layers on my map. There's more than 50 kinds of feature classes that all have different rules and symbology. But the number of files on my computer is actually only about 7 or 8. It's anyway, this kind of thing really matters to other people who work with GIS. So now let's start talking about what are the layers in my map. And the bottom layer is relief shading, which is a super fun topic that there's a lot of literature, and there's a lot of argument about how to make relief shading that looks good. A lot of people, well, if you've ever thought about relief shading at all, you might think there's only one way to do it. But back in the day, relief shading was actually painted by hand. And the Swiss masters who did it actually all have a distinctive personal styles that someone with a real head for this stuff can actually identify the work of a particular relief shader from the days when it was all done by hand. So there's a lot of room for interpretation and exaggeration that brings out different kinds of features on the map. And in Saskatchewan, we don't have a lot of those alpine Swiss peaks that the old school masters were all trained on. So I put quite a lot of work into bringing out the lumpy, dumpy glacial landforms that define life in this province and in the rest of Western Canada. So I can say I've actually done some original work myself to tweak my algorithms so that they best bring out these weird glacial landforms. And this on the screen here in the middle, this is actually the environs of Moose Jaw. This is the vicinity of Moose Jaw. So you can see the Wakimo Valley goes into the Capel Valley up there on the screen. And in the southwest, you have the beautiful Missouri Coteau, which are a low bunch of hills that rise in southwest Saskatchewan. And so Moose Jaw actually has hills on the horizon. I met people here who said, oh, Moose Jaw is so flat, I can't stand it. And anyway, I mean, I hate to correct people about their hometown, but there's places in Saskatchewan that are really flat. The Southwest is not one of them. So there's a lot of fascinating moraines and all kinds of other landforms that emerge from our most recent ice age. And I have really a lot of fun exaggerating them and cranking all the sliders up to 11 just to do a little bit of justice to these underappreciated landforms that never quite get as much press as the Canadian Rockies do. So then above my relief shading, I have land cover. I show the province as being white or green, depending on whether the dominant plant life are cash crops or forest. And I also have some yellow in the southwest for rangeland, where cash crops are not being grown. And so this can really, if you know Saskatchewan, to me, this is one of my favorite things to see on a map, because it really helps with that physical intuition of, oh, I know that this is cropland and there's forest up here. My data source comes from an international consortium. Canada, the US, and Mexico all cooperate to produce one very high resolution land cover data set nowadays. And that suits me just fine, because almost every map of Canada has to show a little bit of the US in the corner. So I can't deal with I have a hard time dealing with Canada-only data sets that cut off there. And now, speaking of Canada-only data sets, my water features all come straight out of a government server. These are downloaded from Natural Resources Canada, and I included a little screenshot of what the user interface looks like because it is not pretty. And so those are some of my basic data sets that concern features in the natural world where there aren't where there are a few ways to visualize them, but there's not a lot of, these aren't human features. We can only change them through great effort on our part. The human geography of Saskatchewan, the legal boundaries and the administrative limits, these all come from the provincial government servers nowadays. And until 3 years ago, these weren't available to the public. So if I had been doing this in 2015, I would have just been out of luck, or I would have had to pay a really exorbitant licensing fee just to get my hands on this data. So nowadays, things are a little more enlightened. The Saskatchewan government is a little more liberal about giving out its proprietary geodata, and it can be used for personal projects like this one, although there's still a few features that are hard to find. And so a lot of what I do is interpreting legal sources, which is fun to me, but not to most other people. So now I've given away what software I use, where I get most of my data. Here's some more about what my map is all about. So the type of map I make is called a reference map. Rather than showing just highways or just waterways or even just topography, my goal is to provide a well-balanced overview of everything in the province that is interesting. And that's really subjective. So this is a little part of my legend, which I hope shows off how interesting the task of deciding what's interesting can be. There's a lot of different features on here, some of which will be rather unclear if you live outside Saskatchewan and aren't familiar with the province's culture or geography. And the fun part is there's even more stuff on my map outside the legend, because if something is truly unique, if there's only one or two of a certain kind of feature on the map, here's a big design tip. Don't put it in the legend. Label it where it is on the map. Either way, you're using the same amount of space on the page, but this way people don't have to divert their eyes to go figure out what a star or a line with a semicircle is supposed to be. So there's all kinds of strange and interesting things on my map, and some of them are actually one of a kind. But one of the broader rules I try to keep to, I call the "what the hell is that giant thing" rule. So when I'm on a road trip, when I'm driving around the province, and there's something out the window that makes me say, "What the hell is that giant thing?" that's a good sign that it should go on the map. And so here's, as a local example, all of the potash mines in Saskatchewan definitely meet this criteria. And so all of them are on my map with a little K for potassium indicating what they actually produce there. And if you look really close, the giant spoil heap at Belle Plaine is actually so big that it faintly shows up in my relief shading just by itself. So here are some other giant things in the province that are on this map because of that rule. I show every wind farm with a little stylized propeller. I show unique roadside attractions like the giant bunnock in Macklin. If you don't know what the hell a bunnock is, it's a kind of bone that Russian Germans have a game of throwing at each other. And also, for instance, the ecclesiastical buildings in the small village of Munster, Saskatchewan, also pass this test because they are big and impressive from the road, in addition to being culturally significant. Another rule I abide by, which is a little sadder, is I call it the heartbeat rule. I like to show businesses that are of interest to tourists, and I try to show as many tourist businesses as I can. But if it's a business that is one heartbeat away from closing, it won't outlive the founder or the current operator. I don't show it on my map. And this picture is actually a sad example from my own village, Val-Marie. We had a wonderful cafe in town renovated by some very passionate people, and an accidental death forced them to shutter, even though they were fairly profitable. A business like a guest ranch or guest cabins, on the other hand, because those facilities, for whatever reason, perhaps because their business is a little less labor intensive, those tend to get bought by new owners when they come up on the market. So I show a lot of cabins and a lot of larger guest houses on my map, but B&Bs and destination restaurants, even though they're super cool and I love them, don't quite make the cut. There's too much uncertainty that they will stay relevant for years into the future. And so here's a little more. So I've said, I download a lot of government data. A lot of what I do is in the public domain. But some things on my map are not in the public domain. They are in the public domain, but that doesn't mean they're easy to find. So here are some of the more unusual sources I have used for my work. So I think this might be fairly close to what people's stereotype of what a cartographer does is. Sometimes I actually do have to go hunting for old survey records, and I do have to punch them into my computer so that an old survey can be integrated with a bunch of other digital information. I don't have to do this too often, but for a lot of historical features, these are the only sources we have, and the government, for whatever reason, may not be interested in doing the work for you and making it easy to put on your digital maps. So why might the government not want this out there? This is actually an indicator of a historic crime. This is a reserve, an indigenous community that was rescinded under suspicious circumstances in the year 1897. Litigation on this one is ongoing because unfortunately there's a difference between whether something is immoral and whether something is illegal. But the federal government is not very enthusiastic about seeing this kind of thing be circulated. So I had to dig into the archives myself and do a lot of tedious hand digitization. Here's another interesting feature that's on here. Saskatchewanians will probably know about the Hutterite colonies. These are very conservative Christians who don't practice private property because the Bible tells them not to have it. They live in communal societies and do a lot of backbreaking farm labor for like a $20 monthly allowance. And Hutterite life is really interesting. They're also very successful because they aren't paying their workforce. So, but the Hutterites have to be able to find each other. And so something that surprises even Saskatchewanians is that the Hutterite colonies are very online. It is in their mutual interest to maintain a up-to-date digital directory of where other Hutterite colonies are. So these ultra-conservative Christian communes actually have basically a digital phone book that anyone can look through. And that made it super easy to add all the Hutterite colonies to my map. Here's the Pennant Hutterite colony in gray, which is a couple miles outside the village of Pennant that it was named after. And here's another interesting feature, which I had to do a lot of original work on. These are abandoned railways cutting across the landscape diagonally because that's the quickest way to get from point A to point B. So these railways were torn out decades ago, but the crops over them never grow quite the same way, even when that dirt is flattened and all surface traces are removed. From satellite, you can still see these railway scars all across the province. And so I spent quite a lot of time tracing these all myself so that my map would have a complete inventory of historical railways. So those are some of the lesser known, more interesting historical features that allow me to say my map shows a lot of stuff that no other map does. So here's the final part of my talk, and this is getting out of theory, and there's some more practicality here. But since I'm spending so much time making all these maps, and I'm the kind of person who would be making all these for free, don't tell anyone that. But while I'm making these, I want to put them on the market. And I want to give as many people as possible the chance to actually get a copy and appreciate it for the most reasonable price I can offer. So this is a little bit about my small business operation. So you might have seen something like this in your life, and you might have this is the CMYK process for the 4-color printing process. But you might have wondered, do they still use this today? Is this archaic? And the answer is that CMYK 4 colors is used for almost everything that is printed in bulk, because getting these 4 colors of ink is super cheap. And so there's a high startup cost because you have to engrave metal plates in order to do CMYK printing. But once the plates are engraved, the unit cost of single printouts is really low, much lower than digital printouts, which use more expensive ink in order to have more flexibility with how the nozzle can operate for one-of-a-kind unique jobs. So because of that, offset printing with 4 colors and with engraved metal plates is the ideal method for me to mass produce my map. And so this is a little close-up of my previous map showing the little 4-colored dots that make up orange Calgary with its light rail network in all other colors. And so high startup cost, low unit cost. I have to get my maps made in Toronto currently, just because of their size. There's only 1 or 2 printing companies that can actually accommodate posters that are longer than 5 feet. And then once all 2,000 copies are printed, then this is how my last map arrived at my house. 2,000 copies boxed into 20 boxes of 100. The total shipment weighed 2,000 pounds. So thank God I paid to get it parceled out into those little boxes. I could have also just ordered a 2,000-pound pallet with no other packaging. That would have been impossible to get off the back of a truck. And so from there, I load these into my basement. And then as demand comes up, as I get orders, I pack all my tubes myself and I bring them to my village post office, which is kind of a simple way of life, but doing all that stuff myself helps me keep my margin as big as possible. I'm not paying for any self-storage. I'm not paying anyone else to pack my tubes or do my shipping. And so that has allowed my retail operation to make up more and more of my income. And so I love telling people how to get started in print themselves, which is why I'm a little liberal about talking about all my business practices. I think there are very few maps on the market nowadays that are actually designed for display. Often, if you see a map on a wall, it was intended for something else. It's usually a highway map or a topographic map. But the way I see it, the more people designing maps in print, the better. It's a really interesting business to be in. And it will stay relevant for as long as people have walls in their house that they want to put interesting things on. So this is where I was hoping to actually have copies with me to sell here. But unfortunately, again, I got snowed in. I've been snowed in for the last 2 days. And so that same storm has kept my 2,000 copies of Saskatchewan, which are printed. They are still stranded in Toronto. So all I have with me right here is my final proof, which is a unique one-of-a-kind test print that I was sent in order to give the go-ahead to produce the other 2,000. So I do have something to show off, but if you are interested in getting your hands on one of these maps, it would be my pleasure to mail one to you. I can promise they will be available imminently. So with that, do visit my website because that's how I sell everything. I also have a gallery of my past work that I've done for other contracts. So if you like maps, you will probably be entertained by my website. That's awmcphee.ca. Little known fact, the W stands for Walter. So thank all of you again for tuning into this presentation. It's really fun to be here in Moose Jaw. And I look forward to hearing any kind of questions as well. So, thank you.
What sort of order you do it in? Like, if you were starting blank, what do you put down and then what do you add?
That's a good question. And I actually tracked my own time for Saskatchewan a lot more closely because with Alberta, I just got carried away and I knew I put 1,000 hours into it, but I had a really poor idea of how it actually progressed. So there are certain, basically I go type of feature by type of feature. So all the wind farms, I will find all of their locations at once, and then I will symbolize them and add them to the map as it is in progress. I'll do all of the populated places at once. I'll do all the Hutterite colonies at once. These are all coming from single data sets. So I'll basically make an episode out of finding the data, collecting all of it. For instance, finding every campground in the province was actually surprisingly difficult and complex. So I'll collect all the data at once. Then I'll decide how I should symbolize it so that it fits into the style of the rest of the map. And then I'll slap it onto my canvas. And then I'll shift everything out of the way where there are conflicts. Because if you've ever designed a map, if you've ever designed almost any map, period, you will notice that things love to be on top of each other. It takes a lot of effort just to separate out labels and prevent overlaps. Oh, sweet. Yoink.
So I have a follow-up question to your labeling. Are you letting QGIS do your labeling, or are you manually doing all this in Inkscape?
It's all manual. With Alberta, I started in QGIS and I came up with a bunch of, I actually used QGIS's like manual label placement features, which are workable, but not as powerful as using Inkscape is. But the further I got into that project, the more I regretted it because things would change unpredictably. I would accidentally delete a data field that was storing whether the labels should be left justified or right justified. So Saskatchewan was, it's kind of like building a house. The second one comes together a lot faster. I committed to having all manual label placement right from the beginning.
No, that's a ton of work. I appreciate that's I have a much greater appreciation for that.
Thank you. And when I was at the NACIS conference in Minneapolis, I mean, a lot of people, I think they were compliments. What they actually said was mostly like, "Oh my God," but it all revolved around me using Inkscape for this whole project.
Is there a reason why you picked Inkscape over GIMP for this? I know GIMP's more raster based.
Yeah, I use both of them, but, and I actually use GIMP to make final edits to my hillshade and my land cover. So my big raster layers, my big like conventional images, I do my touch-ups using GIMP, but GIMP is not very strong at dealing with, it doesn't really store vector features. It's not the greatest for storing curved text. That kind of stuff is more suited to a vector illustration suite like Inkscape or like Adobe Illustrator. And I've heard that Adobe Photoshop itself actually has a lot of vector features added into it now, because they know a lot of Photoshop users don't like the idea of having to learn Illustrator. So they just are putting more and more Illustrator features into Photoshop. But in the open source world, there's no equivalent to that. So as far as I know, GIMP is really quite poor at dealing with anything vector.
Yeah, I concur for sure. It's an interesting take.
I mean, I don't want to get anyone's cornflakes. Like I've seen incredible work done in all kinds of software suites. Even the most expensive and best featured ones, believe it or not. But my all-time favorite cartographer, whose work I look up to the most, actually does all his work in like a cracked 2003 copy of some no-name, long bankrupt vector illustration software. So every time I think my workflow is crazy, I just talk to other people and I think, oh my God.
It's probably Corel Draw.
Yeah.
Alex, are you making your way westward? Are you going to do BC next?
I wanted to, but my wonderful colleague, Jeff Clark, is just releasing a map of basically Vancouver, Victoria, and Seattle.
That's just the Salish Sea, though. We got to get the whole province done.
Yes, but the issue is that from a marketing perspective, just that tiny sliver of BC is, of course, 80% of the province's potential customers. So right. I still want to do BC, but pending further discussion with Jeff, who we get along, even though sometimes I call him my rival. We get along, but I might be pointing towards Manitoba next, just because after doing the other two prairie provinces, I'm way more familiar with the legal environment, and I've made a lot of design decisions that actually hinge around the unique legal norms of the prairies. Surveying in British Columbia is very different than in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So Manitoba is kind of the shoe-in to be the easiest one to do next. But even if I go to Manitoba, BC will be fourth, and I'll probably start working on it like just when I get bored of the same old prairie stuff, like, oh boy, the Canadian Pacific Main Line, oh, another straight line over flat ground. Like I love the prairies, but as someone in this job, there are parts of Saskatchewan that are more and less interesting to me.
Will you commit to doing some field research? I know you had mentioned in past that you like to site visit a lot of these places yourself. Is that a big part of your workflow?
Yes, absolutely. That's how I came up with my design rule that really is based on, is this a feature that will be visible on a road trip? I really rely on traveling as much as I can. And unfortunately, because this was a lockdown project, or it started as a lockdown project, I haven't gotten to as many parts of Saskatchewan as I would really like to. But definitely definitely wherever I go next, I want to spend at least a few weeks driving around to small town museums, because there's just so many local industries and quirks and local norms and cultural features that there are other ways to learn about life in other places, but I really rely on basically getting lost and taking random turnoffs and really annoying my wonderful husband, who has a less spontaneous personality.
Can I ask you about community pastures? I'm from BC myself. I'm not familiar with the concept or the notion. I know it's noted in your maps here. Is that what it sounds like it is?
Yeah, and this is also, this gets very political very fast. The community pasture system was federal until recently. It was a Great Depression relief project to take to take like failed homesteads who had broken ground that never should have been broken. A federal body called the PFRA had the job to basically turn back the clock, say homesteading here was a mistake, and they turned those busted farmsteads into community pastures, into areas that could be rented or access can be leased, but they would be set aside only for grazing, which is less hard on the landscape in the arid, dry land parts of the prairies. And then as soon as Harper got a majority, so I said this would get political fast, the old PFRA, which had been managing this stuff since the 1930s, was completely discontinued. So all of these community pastures were turned over to local boards. So they still exist. They're still run largely the same way. They're used for grazing, and and management is shared between the users of the pastures. But they are no longer just a government program. And so a few other, so for instance, it is now harder for scientific researchers to get access to multiple pastures, because instead of talking to the regional manager who would care about this stuff, they have to talk to a local board in every place. So the system has really changed in the last 10 years, and it's definitely, if you're ever in a small Saskatchewan town, it's one of those things you can definitely ask a random local about and have an interesting conversation for the next 10 or 15 minutes.
We've got another question here in the chat. Can you order a Saskatchewan map now? Do you submit email to you, or is there somewhere hidden on the website?
So if you submit your email, you will get a notification. You will get an email on the day that they arrive. I have not been taking pre-orders because I could be taking pre-orders now because everything is settled and the delay is out of my hands. But because this is a passion project that gets finished on my own timeline, I don't like the liability of taking people's money like a year in advance. So I just have a contact list, but so if you fill it out, I will get back to you as soon as they come off the truck. And also I can promise this is all imminent. I know the address of the warehouse these are all sitting in. They just need to get here. Yes. Yeah, the screenshot I showed in this presentation is actually a sneak preview at what my store will look like in about a week, I hope. So here's another fun business tip. I actually programmed my own web store, which did not save me any time because I had to learn JavaScript to do that. But it does save me $20 a month because I don't have to use Shopify. So yeah, and thank you again. I was a little surprised when I realized people were going to actually use Zoom's voice feature to ask me questions. So I was like, Oh my God, is that you? I looked around the room.
Surprise audio.
But thank you all again so much for consenting to hear me talk for 45 minutes. This was not rehearsed, so but I know it was entertaining to at least a type of person. So.
Alex, was this close to your NACIS talk was that last week?
No, actually, my NACIS talk was totally different. My NACIS talk, which has just been posted online, I'm told. So search for NACIS. That's North American Cartographic Information Society, NACIS. My talk at that conference last week was actually all about Canadian politics. I gave a summary of what makes Canadian election maps different than US election maps. And that was really fun because most of the people in the room were actually US data journalists who specialize in US elections. So at least it was fun for me because all Canadians are necessarily have to be interested in comparative government because we are obsessed with our wonderful southern neighbors and we can't stop thinking about how they do everything there. So so that was what I talked about last week, and I believe that should be on YouTube or something now today. But this is actually my first time giving a talk about how it's done for my map. I have never given a presentation where the focus was on, oh, like what data sources do I actually use? What does my workflow look like?
I'm sure they would have been, well, interested to hear about this too, because this is their bread and butter.
Yeah, and there was a panel of paper map publishers at that conference last week. So that was really interesting too. The funny thing is that it was almost a bad fit for me because although I publish paper maps, I publish paper wall maps, and everyone on the panel publishes paper outdoor recreation maps. So we still are all in the same discipline, but I was fascinated to find out that outdoor recreation map publishers have a totally different business model. And they do a lot of things actually very differently. And they have different concerns about liability and safety because they're more likely to make a product that can get someone killed. So that was really interesting, but there aren't as many people who actually do what I do and publish wall maps nowadays. Although, again, I have so many pre-orders for Saskatchewan. I basically have to finish the rest of the country eventually. So I plan to be in it for a long time yet. Oh, good. And thank you for also finding my YouTube link. So if you like Canadian politics and election maps, then this should also be entertaining to you. And I even delivered it in the same outfit. I'm wearing all denim right now for those of you who mercifully don't have to see me.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, and thank you again for setting this all up. It is a pleasure to be in Moose Jaw. Really, it's a really cute town. So everyone else, you definitely stop in Moose Jaw on your great Trans-Canada road trip, or even better, don't take the Trans-Canada highway. It's really boring. It's like getting off the interstate, but still stop by Moose Jaw anyway. It's very pretty.
Thanks for sharing, Alex. This is really great work you're doing, and we really appreciate it.